I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free. I was born by the river in a little old tent, and just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come.
In the mid-1950s, buses in all the southern states were segregated. Local laws said the seats in the front were for whites, those in the back for blacks.
As long as I am president of the Alabama Public Service Commission, I'm going to see that our segregation laws are upheld.
And then, on December 1st, 1955, a black woman in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat for a white passenger. Her name was Rosa Parks. Her arrest was the final straw for the black community in Montgomery, where a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. was determined to bring about change peacefully.
With understanding, goodwill, and Christian love, we can integrate the buses to Montgomery with no difficulty. I want Montgomery to prove to the world that we will refuse to hit back.
As a seminary student, Martin Luther King had learned about India's great leader, Mahatma Gandhi, who believed that unjust laws could be challenged through nonviolent civil disobedience. King believed that Gandhi's form of protest could be used to overcome the evil of segregation. Along with other leaders in the black community, he called for a boycott of the city buses.
Let it be known by standing on your feet.
Reporters and television crews came to Alabama, and soon people around the nation and around the world were watching the marchers of Montgomery. They marched to work. They marched to organize carpool centers. When they were arrested, they marched to jail. They used what Martin Luther King called the weapon of love.
I look back over Montgomery and think of the fact that for all of these days, 381 days, more than 99 9/10% of the Negro citizens participated in the boycott. They confronted harassing experiences, they confronted physical violence, and never did they retaliate with a single act of physical violence.
The weapon of love won the battle. The Supreme Court ruled 13 months after Rosa Parks' arrest that segregation on Alabama buses was unconstitutional.
The year-old protest against city buses is officially called off, and the Negro citizens of Montgomery are urged to return to the buses tomorrow morning on a non-segregated basis.
The boycott was over. Martin Luther King Jr., along with his fellow leaders of the movement, both black and white, climbed aboard Montgomery's first integrated bus, and all sat up front. The people of Montgomery had not only changed their world, they had changed the times. Three years after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed segregated schools, There still were not any classrooms in the Deep South where blacks and whites sat together. At Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, not one black child had ever enrolled before 1957, when 9 black students were selected to integrate it. 15-year-old Melba Patillo was one of the 9.
I understood education before I understood anything else. From the time I was 2, my mother said, education is your key to survival.
But instead of helping, Arkansas Governor Orville Falbus called in the state militia and ordered them to keep the 9 students out of Central High.
It is my conviction that it will not be possible to restore or to maintain order if forcible integration is carried out in the schools of this community.
In response to the governor's defiance, a federal court ordered desegregation to proceed in Little Rock. September 23rd was to be the first day of integration. That morning, a large group of angry citizens assembled outside Central High School.
On the car radio, I could hear that there was a mob. I knew that the sounds that came from the crowd were very angry, so we entered the side of the building very, very fast. Even as we entered, there were people running after us, people tripping other people.
With the mob vowing to lynch the 9 black students, local police stepped in and removed them from the building. Integration in Little Rock had lasted just part of a morning. In response, Little Rock's mayor made a plea for help to President Dwight D. Eisenhower.
President Eisenhower was not that interested in civil rights by and large. But once courts began ordering school desegregation, it was the obligation of the president to enforce the law. Eisenhower had no choice, and it was a very important symbolic act because it showed that the power of the federal government would be behind the desegregation orders which were coming down from courts, and that Southern whites who thought they could resist would not only be resisting individual people, but would be resisting the force of the federal government.
Mob rule can not be allowed to override the decisions of our courts.
On September 24th, under the protection of the U.S. military, the 9 black students were escorted to Central High School. Among them was Ernest Green. A military convoy took him to school that day.
The whole school was ringed with paratroopers and helicopters hovering around. We marched up the steps with this circle of soldiers with bayonets drawn. Walking up the steps that day was probably one of the biggest feelings I've ever had.
That year, Ernest became the first black person to graduate from Central High.
I knew that once I got as far as that principal and received that diploma, I had cracked the wall.
It was bitterly cold in Washington, D.C. on January 20th, 1961. At noon, 20,000 people filled the wooden bleachers for John F. Kennedy's inauguration.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
That you will faithfully.
The youngest president since Theodore Roosevelt spoke with passion and hope about the importance of freedom.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger.
Freedom's battleground would be the small island nation of Cuba, lying just 90 miles south of Florida. There, Fidel Castro, a communist leader with Soviet leanings, had seized private property and caused hundreds of thousands of Cubans to flee to America into exile. Kennedy wanted to avoid a confrontation.
The basic issue in Cuba is not one between the United States and Cuba. It is between the Cubans themselves.
Kennedy soon learned that the CIA had been secretly training Cuban refugees to take part in an invasion of the island. The CIA believed that, with its help, the Cuban people would rise up and overthrow Castro. Despite doubts, Kennedy gave his go-ahead to the mission. But the invasion at the Bay of Pigs turned into a fiasco. The invaders were captured, the Cuban people didn't rise up, and world opinion came down heavily against the United States and against Kennedy.
This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it.
Following the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet Union and its partners in Eastern Europe tightened their grip. On August 13th, East German communists began erecting a barricade across Berlin. Any of their people who tried to escape would be shot down by armed guards. The Iron Curtain of communism had become a cement wall with barbed wire.
The first warning comes from Cuba. Refugees
And then in the summer of 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev began secretly importing nuclear missiles to Cuba, where they could be aimed at America's most important cities and military targets. On October 16th, through aerial reconnaissance photographs, President Kennedy learned of the missile sites. Military leaders at the Pentagon urged the president to bomb Cuba, but Kennedy refused, fearing it would lead to nuclear war. Instead, on October 22nd, he called for a quarantine of Cuba, widely reported as an act of war, a blockade. And he ordered the Soviets to remove the missiles.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
It became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. One wrong move could start World War III. As Soviet ships moved toward Cuba to break the American blockade, for 6 tense days, the world held its breath. And then Kennedy's unflinching firmness, combined with delicate behind-the-scenes negotiations, paid off. On October 28th, the Soviet Union agreed to remove all missiles from Cuba and ordered its ships to turn around.
I think President Kennedy had to balance off the defense of freedom against the danger of a nuclear war which would destroy everything. The upshot of it was actually, I think, a greater understanding on the part of both Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev of the dangers of nuclear warfare, and it led to a more relaxed relationship between the two. Eventually, the ban on nuclear testing and the pulling back from the brink actually was an important step in the survival of the world.
The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
In April 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. headed to Birmingham, Alabama to join in an anti-segregation march. By now, he was a national figure, often called in to lend his influence in local freedom struggles. The city of Birmingham had plenty of moderate white citizens, but they were used to keeping quiet. Many feared the violence of the Ku Klux Klan.
Whatsoever, and we shall not integrate.
The Klan had helped elect a white racist named Eugene Bull Connor as Birmingham's police chief. To put a stop to civil rights demonstrations, Connor sent attack dogs.
All you gotta do is tell them you're gonna bring the dogs. Look at them run. I want to see the dogs work.
Martin Luther King was tired as he arrived in Birmingham, but there was a feeling of excitement in the air, as if a breakthrough were about to happen. Then, Bull Connor's police moved in to arrest Dr. King. He knelt beside one of the police motorcycles and said a prayer. Then he was taken off to jail. There he wrote a passionate and angry letter to explain the reasons behind the civil rights movement. He didn't have any writing paper, so he wrote on the margins of a newspaper and on toilet paper.
first name becomes nigger. Your middle name becomes boy, however old you are. Then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait.
King's letter from a Birmingham jail was an indictment of American society for permitting racism to continue. But it ended with hope.
We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom.
He talked about freedom as the American ideal, and then turned around and said, well, now blacks want to be part of that. He was asking white Americans, in a sense, to finally, after hundreds of years, confront this contradiction. They believed in freedom, and yet they denied freedom to African Americans. Which was their true self? In a sense, asking white America, are you Bull Connor, or are you someone who believes in human rights? Forcing people to make a choice in a non-threatening manner.
On Friday, May 3rd, a new march took place in Birmingham. This time it included more than 1,000 students and young people. One of them was Patricia King.
Some of the times that we marched, people would be out there and they would throw rocks and cans and different things at us. I was afraid of getting hurt, but still I was willing to march to see justice done.
Once again, Bull Connor called out his forces. Firemen turned on high-pressure hoses. When the water hit people, they were thrown on the ground and rolled screaming down the street. Police dogs bit 3 teenagers so badly, they had to be taken to the hospital. "75 children were squeezed into a cell built for 8 prisoners. Television cameras capture what was happening to Birmingham's children. Most hadn't realized how bad things were for blacks in the segregated South. But now, they saw it for themselves. Martin Luther King's nonviolent protest inspired a remarkable individual in California who adapted King's tactic to his own people's fight for freedom. He was Cesar Chavez, a former migrant laborer who in 1962 founded the National Farm Workers Association. He said, "If you're outraged by conditions, then you can't possibly be free until you devote all your time to changing them." And that's exactly what Cesar Chavez did.
I think that all of us are looking for a place under the sun. By that I mean for a union that we can belong as farm workers, which is going to be built by farm workers, and it's going to be for farm workers.
Chavez led thousands of oppressed Latino farm laborers to strike for better working conditions, for fresh water in the fields, for access to toilets, for fair wages. When he took on the grape growing industry, he inspired millions of Americans to boycott grapes for 5 years until working conditions finally improved. For his efforts on behalf of farm workers everywhere, Cesar Chavez would be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. On August 28, 1963, a huge national march for freedom was scheduled to take place in Washington, D.C. 2,000 buses and 21 chartered trains headed for the Capitol. One man roller skated from Chicago. An 82-year-old man bicycled from Ohio. The marchers were going to demand passage of a civil rights bill, integration of schools by year's end, an end to job discrimination, and a job training program as well. Civil rights leader Roy Wilkins spoke to the crowd of 250,000.
My friends, we're here today because we want the Congress of the United States to hear from us in person and that is, we want freedom now.
The Civil Rights Movement called itself the Freedom Movement, and their cry was freedom now. It brought back home the unfinished agenda of American freedom, and it said, if we're going to talk about freedom, we have to talk about freedom for all Americans. And it was only through a mass movement, the greatest mass movement of modern American history, with thousands and thousands of ordinary people of all ages, all walks of life, taking to the streets to demand freedom in a substantive way in this country, that the Civil Rights Movement succeeded. It is a very inspiring example of how sort of people's struggles for freedom can really change American life for the better.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
Finally, late in the afternoon, the last of the speakers stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It was Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He began with a prepared text. Then something happened. He stopped using his speech and spoke straight from his heart.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.